Hey everyone, today we're going to talk about the top 5 decks at Worlds for each format. Right, I'm going to drop it all in this one video because I'm running out of time. Yeah, and I'm holding my mic this time like a modern day YouTuber. You're not supposed to hold your mic and put them anywhere else, but I'm just doing this because I actually don't have space in my room. And this is going to make me kind of go through the whole thing faster than usual, right? So let's kind of get started. It looks kind of dumb, I'm not gonna lie, but yeah, let's get started. So first off, we're gonna start off with standard. This one, you can already see on the screen what one of the decks is. It's Jeweled Ignis. I actually think this deck is one of the best decks in Worlds at the moment, right? It's once you reach your Ignis, you just kind of start coming back, you win, your opponent can't guard a lot. It's good. You have 2 modes you can switch when you have the correct pieces, right? Even on grade 3 you can push, so it's got some multi-modal capabilities, and overall it's just, you know, any good player can just play out this deck pretty well and know when to damage deny to kind of stall out the game to the correct like timing, and win the game like that. So easy pick for me. But then the second one is also another easy pick, right? It's actually Youthberg. Again, similar idea, where if you get the pieces, you become so strong, you can push very, very quickly. You'll create situations where it's very impossible for your opponent to be able to guard you. The only way you can kind of, you know, maybe stop the aggression is like damage deny, but they only really need 1 CB to go off. And nowadays with the 50 card deck, right, main deck, you have spaces to run things like a counter charger, like an Enunciate Angel, so you can't even be denied if you draw that card, right? So I do think this is very strong. I think it's much more consistent than people give it credit for, and I think it'll perform fine because it'll create situations where, again, your opponent really can't do anything to stop you. Talking about decks that have ways that really prevent your opponent from doing anything, it's Bastion. So any deck that can create a huge field, huge power lines, going first or second on their grade 3 turn is just really, really good, right? Bastion is one of them. It'll create big columns that can't really be interacted with. Front row can't be retired, or I think it can't be retired, right? It basically is really annoying, right? It can't be chosen. It can't be chosen, I think. And then it also gives like power pump, so it's like they'll have those Grandia Edge dragons that just sit there and you can't even attack. Well, you can attack rear, you just won't really be able to get rid of them. It'll just create numbers. Your opponent really can't deal with that, and then or don't have like the math just doesn't work, right? So overall, it's a really, really good ability to have when going into Worlds where everyone is better. You want to create situations where your opponent can't do anything, so they can't use their good skill, their better skill, to be able to outplay you. You can't outplay maths. Let's put it that way, right? Maths will happen. So Bastion will definitely be one of those decks that is just really, really good going into that. And it was doing like the biggest thing as well. It was doing fine in English set 12 meta when they didn't have the owl as well. And sure, everything else got buffed, but now Bastion has the owl, right? So it's just a really, really good deck. And again, like I said, maths doesn't lie. In terms of like aggressive decks, set 13 for us didn't introduce Mygo, but we got Mushiking, and I think Mushiking is still a really, really good deck. We have one deck out there like Jeweled Ignis that doesn't really have like an insane early game. Bastion as well, if we consider those two as one of the better decks in the format, or one of the top 5 decks in the format, definitely Mushiking then has a position, because you drop a Japanese beetle, it hits maths, right? It hits 23k, and there's really nothing much your opponent can do against that. So having an aggressive build like that, or just overall the deck is built to be aggressive, and although, you know, it's 50 cards, now you have to add an extra cards, I feel like Mushiking is one of those decks that is least affected by it, right? You just add in a couple, you can max out your beetles, which equals like 3 more slots that you can put other stuff in. You can add in a few more defensive options, like the Carbuncle, for example, and I think your deck is like pretty much good to go. The deck will just continue doing its thing, being aggressive early on, and just like push, and then yeah, against certain decks like Bastion and Jeweled, you'll have a really good matchup. And even against decks that do have a okay early game, it's not like your deck is awful, right? With the new extra slots, you do have some defensive pieces, so you're not donezo, right? So I think it's fine. I think this will definitely be one of the sleeper picks going into Worlds, right? So keep an eye out for this. And then lastly, to round out the 5, I chose Orphist instead. So I think this slot can be like Orphist or Leonon. I just think the global scene, right, is just like on Orphist way better, right? Just way more, especially than on the JP. So, you know, the JP, like you look at even the stats here. These do include old stats, but if you take them out, the Orphist on the global scene has just been doing insanely well, at least even in the set 12 meta, right? So Orphist definitely one of those strong picks. We don't have Mygo to also have like a second kind of aggressive deck. Orphist will be where it is, and although this could also be replaced with something like Leonorn, I definitely think, you know, the Orphist engine just creates, well, the engine, but just the archetype itself will create like bigger numbers. That is very hard for opponents who effectively guard, while Leonorn will have some issues like pieces. And also Orphist will have just like the added benefit of, again, creating like just really hard numbers for your opponent, but also, you know, you have like things like Brancate over trigger, anything like that can just auto win games better. Like this is a Worlds format where you want to have options where you just straight up beat your opponent, they can't do anything, right? So I think Orphist in that situation is like better than Leonorn. And this deck itself, really hard to damage deny, right? They only need 1 CB to start going off, and even if like the moment they get that 1 counterblast, depending on their build, and this will be one of the more unknown things with Orphist, they can run things like Bobelmine, right? And then suddenly you cannot like damage deny them anymore. It's actually just the unknown factors with that Orphist, the extra 4 cards now, is actually really significant. So that's why I'm putting Orphist on top of Leonorn. But of course, Leonorn is still going to be a very good deck. We might see other like sleeper decks like Greedon come into play. All right, we've seen Greedon do very well in, I think, the French scene. So maybe some of them are bringing that, right? Who knows? But it'll be really cool to see. Moving on to V. All right, V is actually in a pretty interesting format, and it's gonna have a bit of speculation from me, right? But let's kind of talk about the non-speculation things. First is Gurgit, right? Gurgit, after getting its PR, is probably one of the best decks in the format right now. And I think the entire format is going to kind of revolve around the Gurgit, right? Does this deck beat Gurgit? Is this deck an alternative to Gurgit? Is this deck Gurgit? Or how do I make this deck Gurgit, right? Or I mean, how do I make the Gurgit deck better? And you'll see like Gurgit, you'll be seeing some like, I think even some Ezeltex and things like that. But yeah, Gurgit is pretty much the deck to beat. The only deck that I feel like probably has some sort of, how do you say it, like relevance, is a Night Rose deck, right? Night Rose deck also got like any of these decks that are getting its PR is pretty scary, right? And Night Rose also has a very scary PR, being able to extend its multi-attacks. But of course, against Gurgit, it's a bit rough, right? I feel like the Gurgit deck might still be better, but Night Rose is your alternative pick if you just hate facing like Gurgit mirrors as well. The other deck that has really been doing big in BCS was Thavis, right? This deck is definitely not the top dog anymore, but again, it's another Excel deck that is good against the field, right? And maybe if you don't want to play against Gurgit, you can play Thavis. Like Gurgit, how do you really say this, right? Thavis, you are always running Thavis, you're not going anything else. Gurgit can run other, like, you're running a lot of other grade 3s in the deck, so you'll have like more bricking opportunities. With Thavis, you of course have the bricking situation where you just don't draw Thavis, but you have other quality cards that can be put on the early game and then just push, right? You can push. So I feel like this is definitely not the best deck anymore, but it's definitely not like Luard, who I feel like has totally dropped off the metagame, because there's just way better decks, such as these three, that are just better against the field. Now, this is where maybe the speculation starts coming in, right? Because I'll first say one more deck. There could be Highlander that is pretty good, because you'll have it's just, you know, kind of a high roll pop off deck. I feel like something like Ange is just not as good as more, even though they got the PR. So yeah, that's why I'm not gonna put them in. That's just the first thing. Let's start with some of the speculation. So first off, any Narukami deck running Armor Break Dragon can be like just a random surprise. So Vanquisher with Armor Break, right? Bam. The entire format is like very Excel focused, especially with the Gurgit, right? And then to a lesser extent Thavis. You know, random Armor Break coming out when your opponent has a bunch of like Excel circles can just randomly win games. And Armor Break is one of those things that you just don't really see, and like you don't really expect, right? Like, okay, I guess any Narukami deck now that you see, you'll probably see some sort of Armor Break, but it's also something that you really can't do much against. If they have it, they have it, right? So if you see some random people running like a Vanquisher, right, and then an Armor Break, they're trying to counter the meta, and it might be legit, because the situation right now in the V meta is just so polarized around these strong Excel decks that this can randomly do well. Another deck that would be pretty decent is something like Chaos Messiah, right? Generally okay. You run your Chaos is good against the Excels, right, which is the meta, and then your Messiah part is good against that Night Rose part where you can't really, you know, where you're like Chaos doesn't really work, right? So you just kind of go all in. Still like not, I don't know how good this is, right? In V, I feel like V is still going to be very, very polarized around like the Gurgit and the Night Rose, but could be, right? This is a could be situation, right? Chaos Messiah could come out, so we'll see. And then moving on to premium, right? This will be premium meta. I feel like 4 decks, actually like 5 decks are pretty set in stone as like the top 5, and then everything else is following closely behind it, right? They're not like garbage, they're like still very close. It's just that if I make a top 5, I can't make a top 10. First off is Grand Blue. I feel like Grand Blue right now is, you know, this deck that like can do everything and doesn't really, it will have auto lose matchups, but it can do anything against the rest of the deck, right? So against like the elephant in the room is the Ghidorah. If it faces that, then you kind of cry, you feel bad, but then against everything else you're pretty good, and it'll really come down to the skill of the player, right? And in terms of like the consistency of the deck is very, very good. So I think Night Rose, or not Night, like Grand Blue overall is just in a very, very good contention in the current premium format. The next one we have is Katrina. We saw a bunch of the French Katrina builds pop up in Europe, and I do think it's pretty good against most of the metagame, right? Against things like Chaos, you just have a bunch of tokens and there's nothing they can do. Against a lot of other decks, you can just throw down and go fast. Against Ghidorah, it actually doesn't have that much of a bad matchup against Ghidorah, even though you'll reach a situation where you cannot like Superior Call, but at the same time, you have a big rush game that you can just push, and then later on, you still have like different strides and outs that just to finish the game, compared to, you know, compared to what you think, right? What you'd expect. You think it's just like an auto lose bad matchup, but it's actually not. I think it's actually pretty good. And then against Night Rose, you can of course still just throw down cards and push. So overall, I think it's pretty nice. And then of course it's the Ghidorah. I actually think, you know, there'll definitely be players playing Ghidorah. Ghidorah offers that kind of deck where, you know, it doesn't matter how good you are, I create control that you can't really do anything against, and that's that, right? That's it. they'll have auto win matchups against some of the decks, but of course it's going to be harder to get those auto win matchups just because everyone who is going to Worlds will have tested against this deck, and if you have an auto win match, if you have an auto lose matchup or a really unfavored matchup against Ghidorah, you would still have tested it a lot, so that even a really bad matchup has half a chance against it, right? Of course, maybe if it's just so polarizing, they might have just given up on it, but what would have been considered a really bad, like bad matchups against Ghidorah, people will still have tested to the point where they're going, yeah, this deck like will lose 7 times, but I just have to hope it's the 3 times out of 10 where I won in testing that I'm getting those results at the tournament, right? So Ghidorah will probably be a deck, will likely be a deck, but definitely not as, you know, demolishing as the first BCS of the season that we saw, right? Other deck will be Chaos, right? Chaos, I feel like this deck might be brought. A lot of people rate it. Surprisingly, I don't rate it as much. But if it punishes opponents for doing the wrong thing a lot, I do think people will do less of the wrong thing at Worlds, right? It will be the better players. You have to be a better player to make it a Worlds, right? And you can't be losing to mistakes against Chaos. But at the same time, there is limited opportunity on what you can do against Chaos if they just kind of lock your front row, or just lock all your columns or all your circles. There's nothing you can do, right? So once that happens, then no matter what good of a player you are just gonna feel sad. You're gonna feel sad, and that's where Chaos shines, right? So I think this deck will be brought. It has an okay matchup against some of the decks in the format, but against, like, I guess things like the Night Rose and the Katrina. Night Rose, if they lock your front rows, sure, right? Chaos is great, but you know, Katrina has other ways, like, you know, token spam and things like that, where it can be very, very hard. So personally, for me, Chaos, not something I'd probably be too happy bringing, right, if I was playing in Worlds, but people will definitely bring it, right? I think if they've topped with Chaos, or they qualified with Chaos, they're probably still playing Chaos. Yeah. And then lastly is Eradicators. I actually think Eradicators might be the weakest out of the top 5 decks that I'm showing right now, which is a surprise because Eradicators did extremely well in the BCS format and still had to get hit, right? This deck has been taking hits upon hits, but it still continues to do well, and I think it'll still do fine. Like, a lot of people who qualified with Eradicators, I don't really see them changing decks, and because it's a deck that is still doing fine, right? But maybe when you put it, when you give like any of these 5 decks to like good players, Chaos, like the last 3 will be decks that people are taking for reasons. Ghidorah and Chaos because you have, like, you know, polarizing matchups against, you know, some decks where like you're very favored, while Eradicators will be like the least of that, and it'll just be like a good deck that is, you know, good against the wide variety of the field, right? But I feel like good is not good enough, right? You needs to be either like you have to have 2 thoughts going into Worlds. You have to have polarizing matchups where you've read the meta, and then you have very strong favorable chance to beat other like decent players, or you just have to have even gooder decks. So for example, right, if you were to take an Eradicator deck and a Grand Blue deck to Worlds, I feel like the Grand Blue deck has a higher ceiling, right, than Eradicators. Eradicators will like do its thing like consistently, but you need that high ceiling against the better players, and that's why, you know, if you have that choice, you should be taking that high ceiling, right? While Eradicators doesn't have that, which is why I consider it to be one of the weak ones. But it's not a bad deck, of course, right? It's still in the top 5 decks. I think missing here, right, would be like Highlander, Shiranui, quite a few others. Like, even I feel like you can't, you know, underestimate what might be brought to Worlds. It might even be a Dark Irregulars, right? We don't know, right? Dark Irregulars, pretty polarizing matchups in some like situations. Has strong high roll capability, where you can just kind of beat opponents, and this is what you want at World, right? But yeah, that is pretty much my top 5 of each format. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, right? If you have any other thoughts, and I'll see you all maybe like tomorrow. I don't know what I'm gonna do with top decks, it's getting close to Worlds. I don't really want to, you know, like steal people away from last minute testing. So it might just be me this week. It might just be me. So we'll see what happens. Anyway, that's it. See you all later. Right. Bye.